The Montgomery estate glittered like a palace that night. Every window glowed with warm golden light, spilling across the manicured gardens like melted amber. Valets rushed to open car doors as luxury vehicles lined the private driveway, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and one vintage Jaguar that made even seasoned collectors stare. Inside, the ballroom shimmered. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks. Imported marble floors gleamed so brightly they reflected the gowns of every guest walking across them. A string quartet played elegantly in the corner, though the melody was mostly drowned out by the lively chatter of the elite. It was an evening designed to impress. But at the center table, surrounded by wealth and noise, sat an older man in complete silence. Arthur Montgomery, father of billionaire Daniel Montgomery, sat perfectly upright, hands folded gently on his lap, observing everything without reacting. He had been deaf for nearly 12 years, but the isolation he felt tonight had nothing to do with his condition, and everything to do with the people around him. He watched lips move, forming words he could not hear. He watched glasses clink together as guests toasted fortunes that weren't theirs. He watched people laugh, big, exaggerated gestures meant to be seen, not felt. Servants circled with silver trays, but none stopped to ask if he needed anything. Most didn't even realize he couldn't hear. Some didn't care enough to find out. Even his own son, Daniel, barely glanced in his direction. Daniel stood across the room, shaking hands with investors, smiling so wide it looked rehearsed. He leaned in close to speak to them, his voice animated, his gestures grand, all show, no substance. To Daniel, tonight was an opportunity. To Arthur, it was a reminder. A reminder of how small the world becomes when no one bothers to speak your language. Arthur's eyes drifted down to the glass of water in front of him. Condensation slid down its side, forming a tiny pool on the linen tablecloth. He hadn't touched it. For the 100th time, he wondered if anyone even noticed. A waiter rushed past him, nearly bumping his chair. The man muttered an apology without looking back. Completely unaware, Arthur couldn't hear a single word. Arthur sighed and adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, his fingers brushing the worn leather bracelet on his wrist, a gift from his late wife, the only person who ever took the effort to truly communicate with him. He closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he imagined her sitting beside him, laughing softly, gently tapping his arm to get his attention the way she used to. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the glittering ballroom, the cold marble floor, and the crushing quiet that surrounded a man in a room full of noise. Arthur swallowed hard. He didn't need to hear anything to know the truth. He had never felt more invisible. And then, just as he reached for his untouched glass, a shadow approached his table. Someone was walking toward him. Someone who would change everything. Amara slipped through the ballroom like a quiet breeze, seen but never truly noticed. Her black uniform blended into the shadows, and the white apron tied neatly at her waist made her look like every other server gliding between the glittering tables. She carried a silver tray balanced confidently on one hand, her posture straight, her steps soundless on the polished marble. To the wealthy guests, she was part of the decor, another moving piece of the service machinery. They never looked at her face long enough to remember it. They never asked her name. Some didn't even glance up when she replaced their empty champagne flutes. It wasn't new to Amara. Invisibility was something she had learned to live with. But tonight, something felt different. As she moved between clusters of guests, offering hors d'oeuvres with a polite smile she didn't feel, her eyes drifted repeatedly toward a single table, the center table, where an older man sat motionless. Arthur Montgomery. His posture was still, too still, as if he were frozen in a moment everyone else had walked past. His glass of water sat untouched, beads of condensation dripping into a small ring on the pristinely pressed tablecloth. People swirled around him like he was part of the furniture. But he was. Even from a distance, Amara could see the loneliness etched into the corners of his eyes. There was something hollow there, something quietly heavy, not boredom, not disinterest. Isolation. A kind she recognized. Balancing her tray lightly against her hip, she slowed near his table, watching him for another second. His eyes followed the movement around him, but it wasn't the way a man listens, it was the way a man tries to listen, even though he cannot. She felt a tug in her chest. Maybe it was empathy. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the memory of her own grandmother, who had been deaf since birth and communicated through a world that routinely forgot to include her. Whatever it was, Amara found her feet turning toward him before she'd fully decided to move. She approached his table quietly, careful not to startle him. The ambient noise of laughter, clinking glassware, and the quartet's music didn't exist in his world, but her sudden appearance in his line of sight did. Arthur lifted his head. For the first time all evening, he locked eyes with someone. It wasn't a glance. It wasn't polite acknowledgement. It was connection. A small, barely noticeable shift softened his expression, surprise, relief, and Amara felt her breath catch for a moment. She set her tray down gently on the corner of the table, her movements calm and purposeful. One small step at a time, she made sure she was directly within his view. She lifted her hands slowly. And signed. Are you okay? Arthur's eyes widened, his spine straightened. For a second, he didn't breathe. No one had spoken to him in sign language all night. Some hadn't done so in years. Amara smiled softly. She signed again, this time slower, letting each gesture flow gracefully from one to the next. Her hands moved with familiarity, with care, like someone who had learned the language not from textbooks, but from the need to understand someone she loved. Arthur blinked rapidly, emotions swelling behind his eyes. His mouth parted, and he responded with hesitant but grateful signs. You know sign. The corners of Amara's eyes warmed. She nodded. My grandmother was deaf. Arthur looked down briefly, just a flicker, but in that tiny moment his shoulders trembled. Then he looked back up at her with a gratitude that didn't need sound. For the first time since the evening began, he wasn't alone. Amara noticed the tension leaving his hands. She saw the way he blinked more slowly, the way his breathing steadied. The man who spent the night isolated inside a soundless cage was suddenly present, alive, because someone had finally spoken in the language he understood. She glanced at his untouched water. May I get you something else? She signed. Arthur looked at the glass, then back at her. He signed lightly. Just company. It wasn't a request. It was a quiet confession. And Amara felt the weight of it settle in her heart. A guest nearby waved impatiently for her, snapping his fingers as if calling a dog. Amara ignored him, something she would normally never do, because the small, fragile moment happening at this table mattered more than anything else in that glittering room. She pulled the chair slightly, just enough to sit without appearing unprofessional, but still close enough for Arthur to see her hands clearly. The conversation began slowly. Arthur's signing was elegant but stiff, as if his hands were out of practice. Amara responded with gentle pace, repeating motions when he hesitated, never rushing him. It felt almost sacred, this quiet communication in a loud room. He told her his hearing had faded gradually after an illness. He shared that he had once been a musician, something he never spoke about anymore because no one ever asked. He told her he attended events like this for his son's sake, not his own. And finally, after a long pause, he signed. I suppose I am here, but not part of it. Amara's throat tightened. She thought of her grandmother sitting alone at family gatherings while everyone forgot she needed to see their faces to understand them. How often she had looked similarly left behind. Amara signed slowly, deliberately. "You deserve to be included." Arthur inhaled shakily. The message hit him harder than she expected. A shadow of movement drew Amara's eyes across the room. Daniel Montgomery, Arthur's son, was watching, confusion written on his face as he noticed a waitress sitting at his father's table. His eyebrows pinched, and he leaned toward an investor as if explaining something. But Arthur didn't see any of that. His world, for the first time that night, wasn't empty. He lifted his hand, tapping the table twice, a subtle thank you. Amara smiled, understanding it perfectly. Before she stood to return to her duties, she signed one last message. "If you need anything, just look for me." Arthur nodded. She picked up her tray, stepped back into the buzzing river of guests, and disappeared between shimmering gowns and sharp tuxedos. But unlike everyone else who passed by him, she had noticed him. She had seen him. She had spoken to him. And Arthur Montgomery, who had spent years in silence, felt something shift inside his chest. A tiny spark, the beginning of something life-changing. He wasn't sure what it meant yet. But he knew this. Tonight, the world had noticed him in the form of a waitress named Amara. And nothing would be the same after this. Amara lowered her tray carefully, stepping closer to Arthur with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the buzzing arrogance of the ballroom around them. Her hands rose slowly, deliberately, each movement precise and gentle, as if she understood that this moment required softness. She signed, "Are you okay?" And those three silent words sliced through Arthur's loneliness like sunlight breaking through a long, cold fog. His eyes widened, not in confusion, but in something far more fragile, recognition. It had been years since a stranger had addressed him in sign language. The ballroom continued its glittering swirl of noise and wealth, but for Arthur, the moment was utterly soundless except for the sudden rush of emotion flooding his chest. Amara's fingers moved again, her expression warm and open as she signed, "Would you like water or juice?" She made the sign for each drink slowly, making sure he saw every motion clearly. It was such a simple question, ordinary, almost trivial. But to Arthur, it felt monumental. For the first time that evening, someone wasn't talking around him. Someone was speaking to him. The invisible barrier he'd been trapped behind suddenly cracked, and when he lifted his hands to respond, the signs poured out of him faster than he intended, eager, relieved, overflowing. His fingers shaped words he had held inside all night. "I'm fine, thank you. I didn't expect anyone." His hands moved quickly, betraying his excitement. The pent-up stories and emotions behind them pushed their way forward, desperate to finally be understood. Amara smiled softly, following every movement with surprising ease, nodding gently as she signed back, "I'm here, take your time." Those three words struck him with nearly physical force. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't an inconvenience. He wasn't an obligation to be escorted and ignored. He was simply seen. Around them, nearby guests began to notice the rapid motion of Arthur's hands and the elegant, graceful rhythm of Amara's in return. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. A few guests frowned, uncomfortable at the sight of a waitress engaging so directly with the patriarch of the Montgomery Empire. Others watched with mild curiosity, trying and failing to decipher the silent exchange. Quartet continued playing, bows gliding over strings in a melody Arthur could not hear, but the room itself seemed to hush around the small, unexpected connection happening at the center table. A woman in a sparkling silver gown nudged her husband, whispering, "What is she doing?" The husband shrugged stiffly. "Something inappropriate, I suppose." But neither of them looked away. A group of young executives paused mid-laugh, their grins fading as they realized Arthur, silent, stone-faced Arthur, was smiling. Not forced, not polite, but real. His first genuine smile of the evening spread across his face, warming the stern lines age had carved around his mouth. It reached his eyes, brightening them like candlelight catching crystal. The change was startling. The billionaire's father, who had sat in stoic silence for hours, was suddenly alive with expression, hands moving, eyes shining, shoulders relaxing for the first time all night. And at the center of that transformation stood Amara, her posture calm, her attention fully on him, as though the rest of the room did not exist. She nodded again, encouraging him to continue. Arthur's signs grew more fluid, less hesitant. "Thank you, you don't know how long it has been since someone spoke like this to me." Amara's face softened. She signed, "You deserve it. Everyone does." A murmur rippled through the surrounding guests as they tried to interpret the silent conversation. Some looked fascinated, others looked annoyed. A few looked uncomfortable, as if witnessing something too intimate for their liking, but none of them could deny what they were seeing. Arthur Montgomery, long known as the distant, unreachable figure in the Montgomery family, was glowing. The shift in him was undeniable. Even Daniel Montgomery, across the room with a circle of investors, noticed. His smile faltered as he glanced toward the table and saw his father signing, rapidly, joyfully, to a waitress. A waitress? Daniel excused himself with a confused laugh, muttering something about checking on his father, but the investors barely heard him. Their eyes were fixed on the sight of the elderly man they thought they knew, looking transformed. Meanwhile, Amara continued their conversation with gentle patience, her hands steady and graceful. She asked if he needed anything, if he felt comfortable, if he wanted a different drink. Arthur shook his head, smiling again, his fingers lifting to sign quietly, "I'm just glad someone noticed." The words hit Amara harder than she expected. She swallowed, maintaining her composure as she signed back, "I did." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the air felt different, charged, heavy with the weight of something new, something unexpected. Arthur exhaled slowly, deeply, as if releasing years of silence in a single breath. The lonely world he had been living in cracked wide open, filled suddenly with light and warmth from the simplest act of human kindness. And as Amara stepped back, lifting her tray once more, Arthur watched her with a gratitude that needed no sound, no explanation. She had spoken the first words he truly heard tonight, and the entire room, frozen, stunned, whispering, had witnessed the moment a silent man was finally heard. Daniel Montgomery hurried across the ballroom with a strained smile plastered onto his face, the kind he used when investors were watching. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he weaved through guests, pretending nothing was wrong while panic simmered beneath his perfectly tailored suit. He had seen the shocked expressions, the whispers, the way people were subtly turning toward his father, as if something unusual, something unacceptable, was happening at the Montgomery family table. When he finally reached them, he forced out a light laugh that didn't sound natural at all. "Dad, what's going on? Is everything all right?" he asked loudly, as if volume could somehow bridge the silence between them. Arthur turned to his son with a gentle expression that carried none of Daniel's frantic energy. He lifted his hands to respond, fingers forming fluid shapes, relieved, warm, expressive motions that flowed like water after years of being dammed up. But Daniel just stared at him. Eyes blinking, brows furrowing. His face froze in a blank, almost embarrassed confusion. Not a single gesture made sense to him. It was like watching a language from another universe, a language he should have known, a language he had chosen not to learn. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Arthur's hands slowed, faltered, then lowered slightly, as if the realization hit him too. Daniel swallowed hard, his embarrassment turning into something darker, something almost painful. Before he could speak again, Amara stepped forward with quiet composure, her presence steady and respectful. She signed a small apology to Arthur, then looked at Daniel and translated softly, "He said he's happy. He hasn't spoken to anyone all night." The words landed with the weight of a lifetime. Daniel's eyes flicked to his father, really seeing him now, seeing the loneliness in the lines of his face, the exhaustion behind his smile, the way his shoulders relaxed only when Amara was speaking his language. And Daniel felt something sharp twist in his chest. He realized that while he had spent years building companies, building wealth, building an empire, he had never built a bridge to the one person who needed him most. He had learned the languages of business, negotiation, strategy, power. But not the language of his father, not the simple gestures that would have allowed him to understand Arthur's world, not the signs that would have allowed him to say things he never found the words for, like "I care," or "I'm here," or simply "I see you." Daniel's throat tightened as he looked between them, his father signing slowly, gratefully, and the waitress who understood him instantly, speaking his silent language with effortless grace. The realization strung. It exposed everything he had ignored, every dinner where he let his father sit quiet, every event where he assumed silence meant comfort, every moment he wished his father were more involved, but never considered how excluded he might have felt. He hasn't spoken to anyone, Daniel repeated, his voice cracking slightly as he looked at Amara. She shook her head gently. Not once. No one spoke to him in a way he could understand. The shame hit him hard. Daniel felt suddenly small, stripped of all titles and wealth. The room around them blurred as he looked at his father, not the billionaire's father, not the silent figure at family events, but the man who had raised him, supported him, protected him, and waited for him. Arthur lifted his hand weakly, signing something simple, something soft. Amara interpreted quietly, "He's glad you came." The words were a kindness Arthur didn't owe him. Daniel's eyes burned. For the first time in a very long time, the mask of the billionaire cracked. His voice dropped to a whisper only Amara and Arthur could hear. "I should have learned," he said, the regret trembling in his tone. "I had years and I never did." Arthur watched him, his expression gentle, not angry, not disappointed, just tired in a way that only comes from being unseen for too long. The guests continued staring, but Daniel didn't care anymore. His father had smiled tonight, not because of him, but because a waitress had given him what Daniel never did, understanding. And as that truth settled over him, heavy and undeniable, Daniel Montgomery, billionaire, mogul, empire builder, felt the painful, simple truth. He had spent his whole life mastering the world, but never learned how to speak to his own father. Arthur lifted his hands again, but this time the movements were different, slower, heavier, weighed down by years of unspoken emotion. Each gesture seemed to tremble as if carrying a lifetime of hurt. Daniel watched, chest tight, because even though he couldn't understand the signs, he could feel the meaning in the air. Amara stood perfectly still beside them, her eyes following every motion with a seriousness that made the entire table fall silent. She hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because the truth Arthur was sharing held a rawness not often voiced in rooms like this. Finally, with a soft breath, she translated aloud, "He says he felt forgotten." The words cut through the ballroom like a blade. Conversations nearby stuttered to a halt. Champagne glasses paused midair. The glittering evening, crafted so carefully to impress, suddenly felt cold. Amara continued, her voice low but steady. "He felt like noise became more important than family." Daniel flinched. He didn't need a translation for that. Her gaze dipped briefly toward Arthur, then back to Daniel. "And tonight," she said, speaking the last part even softer, "he thought no one would speak to him at all." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His breath stalled in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't even blink. His father, his strong, quiet, patient father, had arrived tonight believing he would be alone in a room full of people he helped raise, support, and guide. Guests around them shifted uncomfortably, staring at their shoes, pretending they weren't eavesdropping even though they absolutely were. Some looked guilty. Others looked ashamed. A few looked downright shocked, as if the idea that Arthur had feelings and that they had ignored them was something they'd never considered. The string quartet continued playing its elegant melody, but now the notes sounded hollow, like a soundtrack to a moment too intimate for such artificial beauty. Daniel swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his stomach. He had spent countless evenings shaking hands with investors, giving speeches, winning awards, yet he couldn't remember the last time he had asked his father how he felt. He couldn't remember the last time he tried to truly see him. It dawned on him, sharp and painful, just how wide the distance had grown, and he had been the one widening it. Arthur lowered his hands, letting them rest gently on the table, but his eyes remained fixed on his son. There was no anger in them, only sadness, a sadness that made Daniel's chest ache. Amara stood quietly between them, the only person in the room holding steady amid the rising tension. She didn't look embarrassed or impatient like some of the guests. She didn't avert her eyes or pretend she wasn't part of a moment meant for family. She simply waited, kind, patient, unshaken. Daniel forced out a breath. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Dad, I didn't know, I didn't realize." Arthur's expression softened slightly but remained sorrowful, his silence louder than any reprimand. Daniel's hands shook as he reached up, trying instinctively to mimic a sign, any sign, but he froze halfway, unsure how to even begin. And that helplessness made his regret deepen. Another wave of murmurs rippled across the room. Some guests whispered behind jeweled hands. Others stole uncomfortable glances at Daniel, silently judging the billionaire who could conquer markets but couldn't speak the language of his own father. The truth settled heavily between them, almost suffocating. The music played on, but it felt meaningless now, pretty noise floating over a man who could not hear and another who had never listened. Only Amara's steady presence kept the moment from collapsing under its own weight. She watched father and son with gentle understanding, as if she had seen pain like this before, as if she knew how deeply silence could hurt when it wasn't chosen but forced. Daniel took a shaky breath and whispered, "I'm sorry." Arthur looked at him, really looked, and his eyes softened, not forgiven, not healed, but heard. For the first time in years, the truth had been spoken, not with anger, not with accusations, but with trembling honesty delivered through the quiet hands of a waitress no one had noticed. And as Daniel met his father's gaze, the noise of the ballroom, the glitter, the wealth, the grandeur, all of it faded into the background, leaving only a father, a son, and the silence between them, finally filled with truth instead of distance. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking, his voice barely steady, the edges of his confidence chipped away by the emotional truth unfolding in front of him. "Where did you learn sign language?" he asked, though the question felt small compared to the weight of everything else. Amara froze for a moment, her fingers tightening around the serving tray before she slowly lowered it to her side. She looked down, eyelashes trembling as she gathered the courage to answer. "My older brother was deaf," she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness that silenced even the nearest conversations. "I grew up interpreting everything for him, doctor visits, parent-teacher meetings, arguments at home, jokes with friends. I was his voice and he was mine." A quiet sadness passed through her expression like a shadow. She didn't try to hide it. "He passed away 2 years ago," she continued, her voice cracking at the edges, "but I never stopped signing." Her fingers twitched unconsciously, as if muscle memory still reached for the brother who wasn't there. The room felt suddenly smaller, tighter, as though the story she shared wrapped itself around everyone listening. Arthur watched her with profound understanding. His eyes softened, full of empathy that needed no words. Slowly, so slowly it felt like time stretched, he reached out and placed his hand gently on hers. His touch was warm, steady, comforting. He lifted his other hand, and with soft, deliberate motions, he signed to her, "Your brother would be proud." Amara's breath caught. The words hit her like a storm and a warm sunrise at once, grief and comfort blending into something overwhelming. Her eyes filled instantly, tears gathering but refusing to fall, shimmering as she blinked rapidly. The entire ballroom faded around her. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the important guests, all of it blurred into unimportant shapes at the edge of her vision. In that moment, it was only Arthur's kind, weathered face, his gentle hand, and the tenderness behind the message he had signed. Daniel watched silently, something shifting inside him as he realized the depth of what Amara had carried and the depth of what she had given his father tonight. The investors, the power players, the elite, they all stared from a distance, witnessing a kind of connection no amount of money could buy. Some looked touched, others looked uncomfortable, out of place in a moment too real for a room built on pretense. Amara tried to speak, but her voice failed. She pressed her lips together, swallowing the rising emotion, then signed softly back to Arthur, thanking him with a trembling grace that made him squeeze her hand a little tighter. Daniel felt his chest constrict. He had known nothing about this young woman, just a waitress in his eyes, someone who blended into the background of events like this. But now he saw her differently. He saw the strength it took to stand in a room full of people who never saw her, the grief she carried with quiet dignity, the love she still held for a brother gone but never forgotten. And he saw the impact she had on his father, a connection Daniel himself had never given him. Arthur held Amara's hand a moment longer, his expression warm and sincere, before releasing it gently, nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just a quiet gesture of respect that acknowledged her story, her pain, and her heart. Amara wiped quickly at the corner of her eye, trying not to let the tear fall, but failing just slightly. She let out a shaky exhale, lifting her chin with a strength that made Arthur smile. The room exhaled with her, as though every guest had been holding their breath. In a night built on glitter and wealth, the most powerful moment came from a truth spoken softly, held gently, and signed with love. And in that moment, Amara was no longer invisible. She was seen fully, deeply, undeniably. By the end of the night, Daniel had made a decision. In front of all the guests, he stood beside Amara and announced, "This woman reminded me tonight of something money can't buy. Connection, respect, family." Then he turned to his father and added, using the first sign he had ever learned, "Sorry." Arthur cried. The billionaire guests watched silently, humbled. In the weeks that followed, Daniel hired Amara as his father's personal interpreter. She received triple pay and full benefits. Arthur finally had someone who understood every word he signed. And Daniel began learning sign language every evening. Slowly, a family that had lived in silence learned to speak again. And it all started with a waitress who refused to let a good man sit alone in silence.